Matter, on the contrary, is not an existent thing, but is being in the form of a universal or in the form of a notion. Reason, which is still instinctive, makes this correct distinction without being aware that just by testing the law on all sensuous being, it gets rid of the merely sensuous being of the law, and when it interprets the moments of the law as matters, their essential nature has become for reason a universal, and as such is expressed as a non-sensuous thing of sense, as an incorporeal and yet objective being. In paragraph 252, Hegel is continuing his investigation from a phenomenological perspective of what it is that goes on when we observe nature and arrive at laws, which then we attempt to apply to nature. And there's an ongoing dialectical process between observing and forming laws and then seeing how those laws pan out and seeing how they change in the process. He introduced this term matter or materie in the previous paragraph, saying that the sensuous things that we are applying the law to are really, you might say, placeholders or appearances or in the way of the matters that we're really trying to study. We're trying to get to the essence of things when we're working with law. So he tells us more about this, saying matter is not an existent thing. The thing there is just ding, right? So anything that can be a thing for us, an object. And he says that it's not an existent thing. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have being, sein, but it has being in a different way than, say, a thing like this, a piece of chalk. So what is it then? And notice I underlined the is. What is this kind of matter that we're talking about? So he goes on and he tells us that what reason in its instinctual activity is able to realize and to differentiate is between what the matter is and what the sensuous things that are being studied through the use of a law. These matters, like, for example, base and acid or positive and negative electricity, are being, and here the translation is a little bit misleading because it uses the same formulation. He says, this is Miller's translation, being in the form of a universal or in the form of a notion. It's actually being as a universal, als allgemeine, right? And then in the form of a notion, a Begriff. So what's going on there? Well, we don't have to be so worried about the lexical differentiation. We want to see what we're differentiating these against, and that is the sensuous being to which the law is being applied and from which we presume the law is being made to emerge. And this process is not entirely clear at this point. So he goes on and he says, reason is not aware that just by testing the law on all sensuous being, what it does is it in a certain way purifies the law. What does it purify the law of? That sensuous aspect. It turns the law into something that, although it does apply to sensuous particulars, is not itself a sensuous particular. It's something that has a different metaphysical status, we could say. So he goes on and he says, when it interprets the moments of the law as matters, their essential nature has become for reason a universal, right? And here's a wonderful phrase. It is expressed as a non-sensuous thing of sense. Now, what does that mean? A non-sensuous thing of sense. So we don't have the universal as something that's totally detached from sense. What we have is the universal, which is being developed into a concept or a notion, as something that you might say straddles the entire sensuous world to which it's to apply, and permeates in a certain way that sensuous world, which shows us that there is more than just that sensuous world, that what we might call a vulgar, mechanistic, materialistic attitude about the observable world is a rather restrictive way of looking at it. So what we're going to see come out of this is what else is involved. And so he's setting the stage for that right here. We have now to see what turn its result takes for it and what new shape its observational activity assumes in consequence. We find as the truth of this experimenting consciousness pure law, which is freed from sensuous being. We see it as a notion which, while present in sensuous being, operates there independently and unrestrained, and while immersed in it, is free of it and a simple notion. This which is in truth the result and essence of its activity is now present to this consciousness itself, but as an object. Further, since for it the object is not a result and is not connected with the preceding activity, it presents itself to consciousness as a particular kind of object, and the relation of consciousness to it appears as another kind of observation. In paragraph 253, Hegel is talking about observation taking on a new shape or gestalt, and he wants to lead us into the activity as phenomenologists of observing the development of consciousness in reason, figuring out what is that new shape. So what I've got laid out here on the board is pretty straightforward. It follows along with this passage. He talks about this experimenting or seeking consciousness, right? As grasping now that it's got a pure law or present to it in the form of a notion, that which is essential. We've seen that this can be connected to, but also at the same time is independent of sensuous being. Notice I put this in plural here, because what we're talking about is an entire range of sensuous beings that are concrete particulars. And the law itself is supposed to be a universal which governs all of these particulars. A universal in a different way than, say, the universal corresponding to these particulars, if we're talking about marbles, right? And then we talk about marble, capital M, the Platonic form, or whatever we want, the universal. Law is a bit more complicated than that. Now, Hegel says that this right here is a result, he just uses that word, or essence, a Wesen, but that consciousness is not going to grasp it as a result or essence. Rather, consciousness is going to grasp the law as an object, a Gegenstand, for consciousness. And he says that this produces a new observation. The way that Miller has it here in the text is it's present to consciousness as a particular kind of object, and the relation of consciousness to it appears as another kind of observation. So what's happening here is that consciousness, in its process of trying to work out laws, stripping them away while not actually breaking the connection between the laws and the empirical realities, in which the consciousness, by the way, also exists, is making the law itself into a particular kind of object for it, which then it can continue to study. Such an object in which the process is present in the simplicity of the notion is the organism. It is this absolute fluidity in which the determinantness, through which it would only be for another, is dissolved. The inorganic thing has determinantness for its essential nature, and for that reason constitutes the moments of the notion in their completeness only together with another thing, and therefore is lost when it enters into the process. In the organic being, on the contrary, every determinantness through which it is open to another is controlled by the organic, simple unity. None of them shows itself as essential, as free to enter into relation with another, and consequently what is organic maintains itself in its relation. You might at this point be wondering where all of this discussion about the nature of law as concept or notion or begriff, and observing consciousness. Where is all this going? Well, in paragraph 254, Hegel is going to make an important turn that shows us what he's really after in this discussion. And I don't know whether you can say that the sort of inherent necessity of it is being actively demonstrated. I think that in some respects, and this is a complete aside, he could be expressing himself a bit more clearly at this point, but he seems to feel or think or judge that the mode of presentation that he's providing us here is what we need to be following along in order to see why things turn out the way they are. Now, notice that what we've got here on the board and what's corresponding to this passage is a distinction between an inorganic thing and an organism, which we should also say an organism is also a thing, right? But it's a different kind of thing than thingly things, than things that are just inorganic. And what he's going to call our attention to here, by talking in terms of fluidity of determination as opposed to mere determinanteness, is the fact that the organic thing, the organism, that we're trying to observe and formulate laws about, has a way of resisting our capacity to generalize, to conceptualize about it. And the further that it's removed from the merely inorganic, the more complex this gets. This is foreshadowing, of course, where we're going to be looking at the human organism, the creature that is involved in this entire process of observation. I don't want to get too far ahead of us. Let's look at what he says here in this passage then. He says, such an object, right, this particular kind of object, is present in the simplicity of the notion as the organism. And it's an absolute fluidity, we see this in his discussion of life, in which the determinanteness through which it would be only for another is dissolved. There's a kind of controlling of the relationship between the other and the self that occurs with organic beings that does not occur with inorganic beings, which react with each other chemically or physically or whatever we want to say, but don't end up controlling what's going on. And so, as Hegel's going to say, the inorganic thing has determinanteness for its essential nature, right? It is what it is. For that reason, constitutes the moments of the notion in their completeness only together with an other thing, right? So, for example, acid, base, right? Positive, negative electricity. These are not organic things at this point. Chalk and whatever other things we want to connect it with. He goes on and he says that they're lost when they enter into the process. Now, does that mean that they vanish off the scene, we don't know what we're talking about? No, but there's a lack of essentiality to them that is present there in organic being. How so? Well, that is part of what we're going to have to unpack in the following paragraphs. But he says here, with the organic being, every determinanteness through which it's open to an other, right, its own determinanteness, is controlled by the organic simple unity. So it is connected with the other, with alterity, but in a certain way it controls that relationship with its other. And that's why it can take in its other in a way that this can't, and can react to new circumstances. So he says what's organic maintains itself in this relation with the other. It doesn't vanish. It doesn't shuffle off the scene. It remains more essential, we could say, in Hegel's language. The aspects of law which the instinct of reason here proceeds to observe are as follows from the above characterization. In the first instance, organic nature and inorganic nature in their relation to one another. The latter is, for organic nature, no more than the freedom a freedom opposed to the simple notion of organic nature, of the loosely connected determinantnesses in which the individual forms of nature are dissolved and which, at the same time, breaking away from their continuity, exist on their own account. Air, water, earth, zones, and climate are universal elements of this sort, which constitute the indeterminate simple essence of natural individualities, and in which these are at the same time reflected into themselves. Neither the individuality nor the universal element is absolutely in and for itself. On the contrary, though they appear to observation as free and independent, they behave at the same time as essentially connected, but in such a way that their independence and mutual indifference are the predominant feature and only in part become abstractions. Here, then, we have law as the connection of a universal element with the formative process of the organism, which, on the other hand, has the elementary being over against it, and on the other hand exhibits it within its organic reflection. But laws of this kind, animals belonging to the air have the nature of birds, those belonging to water have the nature of fish, animals in northern latitudes have thick hairy pelts, and so on. Such laws are seen at a glance to display a poverty which does not do justice to the manifold variety of organic nature. Besides the fact that organic nature in its freedom can divest its forms of these characteristics, and of necessity everywhere presents exceptions to such laws or rules as we might call them, the characterization of the creatures to which they do apply is so superficial that even the necessity of the laws cannot be other than superficial and amounts to no more than the great influence of environment. And this does not tell us what does and what does not strictly belong to this influence. Such relations of organisms to the elements they live in cannot therefore in fact be called laws. For firstly, the content of such a relation, as we saw, does not exhaust the range of the organisms concerned. And secondly, the sides of the relation itself are mutually indifferent and express no necessity. In the notion of acid lies the notion of base, just as the notion of positive electricity implies that of negative. But often as we may find a thick hairy pelt associated with northern latitudes, or the structure of a fish associated with water, or that of birds with air, the notion of north does not imply the notion of a thick hairy pelt. The notion of sea does not imply the notion of the structure of fish, or the notion of air that of the structure of birds. Because of the freedom of the two sides in relation to each other, there are also land animals, which have the essential characteristics of a bird, of a fish, and so on. The necessity, just because it cannot be grasped as an inner necessity of the creature, ceases to have a sensuous existence and can no longer be observed in the world of reality, but has withdrawn from it. Finding thus no place in the actual creature, it is what is called a teleological relation, a relation which is external to the related terms, and therefore really the antithesis of a law. It is a conception completely freed from the necessity of a nature, a conception which leaves that necessity behind and operates spontaneously above it. We're going to begin this long paragraph, number 255, by talking about law. And ultimately, we're going to end up introducing a concept of teleological relation, which Hegel is going to say is opposed to that of law, opposed in part because the necessity that it imposes is a necessity that stems from a greater freedom. So that's going to be a key idea here. Let's see how that actually plays out. You notice that I've got organic nature, inorganic nature being contrasted to each other here. So he says these are these aspects of law. And when we're talking about law here, we don't just mean very universal laws like gravity. We're talking about observing consciousness, attempting to expand its storehouse of information, of knowledge, by observing things in the world, things that it runs across, and trying to go into their specificity, trying to generalize from that basis, trying to come up with law-like regularities that it says that it can observe in nature. So, how does this pan out? He says, in the first instance, we have organic nature and inorganic nature in their relation to one another. What do we mean by that? Well, organic nature would be, say, everything from, I suppose, it depends on exactly how you want to qualify or classify viruses. I would say that they're organic. Everything from viruses all the way on up to human beings, gigantic fungoid colonies, ant hills, everything that you want, plants, one-celled organisms. All of those are organic nature. All of them involve certain basic functions that we're going to see talked about in later paragraphs. Now, they exist in relation to a wider environment of inorganic nature, right? Of which some parts might, in fact, be organic. If we talk about, he talks about Earth, for example. So if we're thinking in terms of, just pure minerals, okay, that's not organic. But if we think in terms of soil, okay, that is something that has some organic qualities or components to it. In any case, he says, the latter, that means this relation for organic nature, no more than the freedom, a freedom opposed to the simple notion of organic nature, of the loosely connected determinantnesses in which individual forms of nature are dissolved, in which at the same time breaking away from their continuity exist on their own account. What does all that mean, Hegel? Well, he's talking about how in inorganic nature, as we've observed, as we've seen observing reason observe, there are things of certain classes, things of what we might call repeatable determinantnesses, and these are loosely connected with each other, but we can come up with laws about them. We can say things that are meaningful about air or water or soil or minerals, or the way in which the zones of the world are set out, in terms of latitude, longitude, climate, all these sorts of things we can indeed talk about meaningfully, and we can observe. And so human beings have been doing this for a very long time. So he says these constitute the determinantnesses that we're looking at: air, water, earth. These are indeterminate, simple essence of natural individualities, which are reflected into themselves. There's the Hegel's philosophy of nature. I wouldn't worry too much about that, because the real show here is on the other side when we're dealing with organic nature. Now, inorganic nature behaves the way that it does. We can come up with sciences like physics and chemistry and even meteorology, geology, things like that, to sort of explain what's going on with these things that we observe. Organic nature, now we're venturing over into biology, right? And some of the other ones later on as we get to more and more complex things. That's not quite so straightforward as this is. So he says, here we go. Neither the individuality nor the universal element is absolutely in for itself. They appear to observation as free and independent. We're talking about the inorganic. They behave as essentially connected. But what's going on there is there's a sort of mutual indifference to each other. They exist for consciousness. What about the organic being? He says, here we have law as the connection of the universal element with the formative process of the organism, which on the one hand has the elementary being over here, over against it, and on the other hand exhibits it within its organic reflection. What is he talking about there by talking about organic reflection? The organic being works upon its environment, its world, on other organic beings, but also on the non-organic, and takes it in, reacts to it, modifies it, consumes it, excretes it, does all these sorts of things that can't happen on their own just by inorganic nature, with its very interesting and complex processes. But organic nature brings a kind of reflectiveness, a kind of intensity to things that we're going to see Hegel exploring in the passages, the paragraphs yet to come. So what's the upshot for law? Here's where it gets really interesting as far as the discussion of law goes. So he says, there's a temptation to make all sorts of generalizations that we want to call laws about organic nature. What are the examples that he uses? Animals in the air have the characteristics of birds. And, that kind of makes sense, right? What are birds' characteristics? And maybe they have wings, right? So insects that fly, yeah, okay, they're birds. If we had flying serpents, presumably they'd have to have wings, right? And we can go on further and further. Animals in the water have the characteristics of fish. What are the characteristics of fish? Well, they breathe water, and they have fins, and we can go further and further, right? Here's another great one. Animals in northern latitudes, and he means by this really far northern latitudes, have thick, hairy pelts. Think about beavers and bears and caribou and whatever else that you like. So does this work? He says these laws display a poverty that doesn't do justice to the manifold variety of organic nature. These laws don't turn out to really be laws in any full sense. Why? He says it's clear that inorganic nature, and here we're talking about these basic large-scale things, does in fact have an environmental effect in conditioning what happens with organic nature. But on the side of organic nature, there is an incredible determinate freedom, a capacity to shift around whatever conditions this is imposing upon it. Add to that, Hegel hasn't even gone this far yet, that organic nature is not only, you might say, locked in a relational struggle with inorganic nature, but with other organic nature itself, within its own species, in relation to other species of manifold different types. So he says, organic nature everywhere presents exceptions to such laws, or rules we might call them. The characterization of the creatures to which they apply is so superficial that even the necessity of the laws must be superficial. And if we call necessity superficial, it's not really necessity at all. So he says, these relations of the elements, of the organism to the elements they live in cannot be called laws. Why? The content of such a relation does not exhaust the range of the organisms involved. So you can have organisms that do seem to fall under these laws, but you also have organisms that somehow escape those laws, so they're not really laws, and the environment doesn't really fully determine the organic creature. Then he goes on and he says, the signs of the relation itself are mutually indifferent and express no necessity. This is another sort of more metaphysical point. He says, in the notion of base, there is contained the notion of acid and reciprocally, right? So there's a mutual implication there. Positive and negative electricity, too. All that's over here on the side of inorganic nature, by the way. Even though, organic nature might have acids and bases, stomach acid, things of that nature. But there is no sort of necessary mutual implication there. For example, with northern climates, that doesn't necessarily have to produce hairy, thick pelts. And you can find other animals with hairy, thick pelts in conditions elsewhere. Likewise, he says, birds with air, you can in fact find birds flying around in air, but the notion of air does not imply the structure of birds by itself. There's many other possibilities. So he says, because of the freedom the two sides have in relation to each other, there's also land animals, which have these essential characteristics of a bird, of a fish, and so on. Then he says the necessity, because it cannot be grasped as an inner necessity of the creature on this side, ceases to have a sensuous existence, and it can't be observed in the world of reality, but is withdrawn from it. So these laws are things that could exist in, say, a textbook, But then when you try to go apply the textbook to reality, you find out reality is a hell of a lot more complicated than the textbook, and you're understandably upset that the textbook doesn't seem to apply quite as well. I mean, one possible thing is kill every animal that doesn't fit the textbook definitions, but that would be an interminable task. Or you can just, blind yourself and pretend that you can't see those animals, but then you're disconnecting yourself from the reality that you wanted to understand. Reason doesn't do that. Reason has a desire to know. And so when reason runs into an obstacle like this, it's going to have to somehow figure out how to surmount that obstacle. What is going to surmount that? This is where Hegel is going to turn to what he's calling a teleological relation. So he goes down and he says, finding thus no place in the actual creature, the necessity, it is what is called a teleological relation, a relation which is external to the related terms and is really the antithesis of a law. What is he talking about there? Okay, so a teleological relation is a relation to some sort of telos, some sort of end, some sort of process of unfolding, of developing, of reaching a destination, a point, you can say. Although sometimes the telos can be simply just to continue things on as they are. So if this necessity is not going to be found in the inorganic nature and its relationship to the organic being, the creature, the organism, we're going to have to look for this relationship elsewhere. And he says it's a conception completely freed from the necessity of nature, a conception which leaves that necessity behind and operates spontaneously above it. Now that seems to throw a big monkey wrench into any notion of law. Hegel's goal, as we're going to see him moving into the next paragraphs, is to expand the conception of law so that it can actually take into account teleology. And that's, quite a project to embark upon. It's going to end up requiring us to rethink the ways in which we typically frame for ourselves all of this.